The barn was eerily quiet that night. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of the animals, and the soft rustling of straw as the wind crept in through cracks in the walls. In the dim light of the lantern, a foal was struggling for life. Born weak and sickly, it barely had the strength to stand on its wobbly legs. The experienced hands of the farm's caretaker had never seen such a frail creature. It was a miracle it was even alive, and yet, even with all the love and attention it was given, the foal seemed destined for nothing more than a short, painful life. In those first few days, the foal didn't even appear to understand the most basic need of any living thing: survival. It could barely drink from its mother. The other animals seemed to sense it, too, avoiding the fragile little creature as if it were already lost. The people who worked at the farm tried everything to help it. Bottles of warm milk, extra blankets, gentle coaxing, they poured their hearts into saving this foal, but no one truly believed it could survive. But something deep inside that tiny, sickly body refused to give up. No one knew it yet, but this little foal had an unbelievable story waiting to unfold. It wasn't just a survivor, it was destined to become something far greater than anyone could imagine. Days turned into weeks, and the foal's conditions slowly began to improve. With each passing day, it grew stronger, taking a few more steps, standing a little longer, and even starting to play in the fields. Still, doubts lingered. Was it enough? Would it ever be healthy enough to live a full life, let alone do anything remarkable? Then, one morning, something changed. It wasn't just the way it stood. It was the way it moved. The foal had an energy about it, a spark that no one had seen before. It was as if it was suddenly aware of its own potential. As time went on, the transformation became impossible to ignore. The sickly foal that had barely survived its first few days now seemed to be thriving. It was running through the fields, kicking up dust behind it, its coat shining in the sun. The farm hands looked on in disbelief. Could this really be the same foal that had seemed like it would never make it? But there was still more to come. This foal, who had defied the odds to even survive, was now showing signs of something even more extraordinary. It wasn't just any foal. It was a foal with something special, something no one could quite explain. As the foal grew, so did the questions. What was this creature capable of? What had transformed it from a weak, sickly animal into something so vibrant, so full of life? Was this just a remarkable case of nature defying the odds, or was there something more at play here? And then, as if the foal had been waiting for the perfect moment, it did something that no one expected. In one single, breathtaking moment, it revealed its true potential, a skill, a power that had never been seen before. But the story doesn't end there. What this foal would go on to accomplish, what it would become, would shock everyone who had ever doubted it. The transformation was far from over. What happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about strength, perseverance, and what it means to truly defy the odds. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what this foal grew up to be. The farm had always been a place of hard work, quiet moments, and the rhythms of rural life. But that winter had brought an unexpected sense of urgency, especially when the foal had arrived. No one could have predicted the struggles it would face, and no one could have predicted how it would defy every expectation. The farm hands and caretakers had seen many births over the years, but this one, with its fragile, struggling newborn, felt different. There was a sense of helplessness that hung in the air, especially when the foal didn't show the typical instincts of a healthy newborn. For the first few days, the foal lay still, only occasionally lifting its head to take in the world around it. Its mother, a seasoned mare with a calm temperament, watched with concern, unsure of how to help her new offspring. The caretaker, an older man who had worked on the farm for decades, had never seen anything quite like it. He'd dealt with sickly animals before, but the foal's weakness felt almost unnatural. Every time he checked on it, he found himself hoping for a sign, a flicker of energy, a shift in its condition, but every time, it seemed like the foal was slipping further away. The people around the farm couldn't help but talk. In hushed tones, they whispered about the foal's chances, the slow, agonizing way it fought for life. They could see the foal's frailty, and though they didn't say it aloud, they knew what would come next. There was a quiet resignation in the air, a collective understanding that it was unlikely this little one would make it. After all, the odds were stacked against it. The air seemed to shift, the tension in the field rising. Everyone watching could feel it. There was something about to unfold. But what? The foal stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, its gaze fixed on something in the distance, something only it seemed to see. The caretakers called out, but the foal didn't respond. It was as if the world around it had faded away. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment passed. The foal shook itself, as if snapping out of a trance, and trotted back to the barn, its head held high, its body strong. What had just happened? Why had the foal acted that way? What had it seen in that brief moment? The caretakers could only exchange confused glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Was it a fluke, or was there something more to it, something they hadn't yet understood? It wasn't long before the farm's visitors began to speculate. Some said the foal had tapped into some kind of ancient power, a hidden energy that few creatures ever experienced. Others whispered that it was connected to something spiritual, something beyond the physical world. No one could say for sure, but one thing was clear: the foal had crossed a line, and it was no longer just a weak, sickly animal. It was becoming something far greater, something far more mysterious. And the strangest part? No one knew what would come next. The foal's future remained uncertain, and yet there was a sense that whatever was about to unfold would change everything. Would it become the legendary creature some believed it was destined to be? Or would it fade back into the background, a mysterious anomaly that no one could fully understand? The foal's journey had only just begun, and the path ahead was shrouded in mystery. What would it grow up to be? The answer, as always, remained just out of reach, waiting to be discovered. And though the farm hands and visitors couldn't help but feel a sense of awe, they couldn't help but wonder, what was the foal preparing for? The days that followed the foal's strange moment of stillness were filled with an unsettling calm. The farm continued its daily routines, with the usual tasks of feeding, cleaning, and caring for the animals. But there was a shift in the air, a subtle tension that seemed to hang over everything. The foal's sudden burst of energy, its almost mystical movement across the field, had left people questioning things they had never considered before. What was it about the foal that set it apart? What had they witnessed? Was it simply a fluke, a product of chance, or something much more profound? The farmhands couldn't stop talking about it. Some of them, who had known the foal from the very beginning, were still convinced it was nothing more than an unusual survivor. But there were others, those who had come from outside the farm to witness the foal's progress, who were starting to entertain other ideas. They whispered about the foal's potential, about the way it moved and seemed to understand its own body, as if it had some kind of hidden intelligence. They began to speculate about what it might become. Could it be something more than just an animal? The caretaker, the man who had been there when the foal was born, struggled to reconcile the foal he had seen with the one that stood before him now. He had watched it nearly die in those first few days, watched it struggle to drink from its mother and barely muster the strength to stand. Now, it was an entirely different creature. He found himself questioning everything he had known about animals and survival. Could a weak foal really transform so completely, so suddenly? Or was there something else, something darker at play? The mare, the foal's mother, seemed to sense the shift as well. She watched her child with a mixture of concern and confusion, never fully understanding the strange change in its behavior. She had always been a calm, reliable presence on the farm, but now, when she looked at her foal, there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It wasn't the normal worry a mother might have for her young, it was something deeper, something unsettling. The foal was growing stronger, yes, but in ways that didn't quite make sense. There was something in its eyes, a kind of intelligence that shouldn't have been there so soon, a knowledge that seemed far beyond its years. As the weeks went by, the foal's behavior became more erratic. It would suddenly break into a run, charging across the field as if it were being driven by some unseen force. Sometimes, it would pause in the middle of its play, staring into the distance as if it were listening to something no one else could hear. On other occasions, it would turn and trot to the edge of the field, as if it were waiting for something or someone. And then, there was the way it interacted with the other animals. At first, the foal had been timid and unsure, barely able to stand on its own. But now, it seemed to dominate the other animals, not in an aggressive way, but with a quiet, unspoken authority. The other horses, once friendly companions, began to step aside when the foal approached, as if they recognized something in it that they couldn't quite comprehend. Even the farm dogs, who usually kept a close watch over the herd, seemed to give the foal a wide berth. It was as if they knew instinctively that it was different, perhaps even dangerous. The caretakers couldn't explain it. They had no words for the strange behavior they were witnessing. Some of them began to talk among themselves, their voices low and hesitant, as though afraid someone would overhear. They wondered if something had gone wrong when the foal was born, if it had somehow been marked, cursed, or even chosen. No one spoke of it aloud, but the fear lingered. Could the foal be dangerous? Was it capable of something they didn't understand? But for all the growing uncertainty surrounding the foal, there was one person who remained steadfast in his belief that the foal was simply an extraordinary animal, nothing more, nothing less. The caretaker who had raised the foal from its weakest days remained determined to prove that it was merely a case of nature at its finest, a survivor, a creature born with an incredible will to live. Yet even he began to doubt, as the foal's behavior became increasingly bizarre. One evening, after watching the foal run across the field once again, the caretaker sat on the porch of the farmhouse, his mind racing. Was he missing something? Was there something deeper, something more complicated at play? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering a truth, one that would change everything. As the foal grew older, it became clear that something was happening to it, something that couldn't be explained by simple biology. Its speed, its strength, its uncanny ability to outthink the other animals, none of it seemed to fit with what anyone knew about horses. The farmhands began to speculate that perhaps the foal was more than just a rare, strong animal. Maybe it was something entirely new, something that didn't belong in their world. Meanwhile, the quiet farm, once a peaceful place of hard work, was becoming a battleground of sorts. The caretaker who had watched the foal from the beginning clung to the idea that it was just a remarkable animal. But the others, especially the newer farmhands and visitors who had begun to take notice, were increasingly uneasy. Some even suggested that the foal wasn't an animal at all, it was something else, something beyond understanding. There were whispers of strange forces, of energies that transcended the natural world. One evening, as the foal wandered off into the woods beyond the farm, a group of farmhands gathered around the dinner table, their voices low and filled with suspicion. They spoke of the strange behaviors they had witnessed, the moments when the foal had acted as if it were listening to something distant. They shared stories of animals behaving oddly around it, stepping aside, backing away as if they could sense a presence beyond the foal's own body. Even the farm dogs, who had always been fearless, had started avoiding the foal altogether. One of the farmhands, a young man who had recently started working on the farm, spoke up. He had been the first to notice the way the foal seemed to lead the other animals, how they followed its movements without hesitation. It was as if the foal wasn't just an animal, it was the leader of something greater, something they couldn't see or understand. The young man wondered aloud if the foal had been marked by some unseen force, something that had changed it from the inside out. No one said anything for a long moment, the words hanging heavy in the air. They all knew there was something off about the foal. They could feel it in their bones, this creeping sense that they were on the edge of something they couldn't control, something they couldn't predict. The foal, for all its growing strength, was becoming something more. Something dangerous. Something they couldn't comprehend. And with every passing day, it seemed to move closer to a fate none of them could foresee. It wasn't just the foal that was changing. The farm itself was becoming a place of tension, of uncertainty, as the caretakers, the animals, and even the land seemed to respond to the foal's presence. The farm that had once been a quiet refuge was now a place of whispered conversations, fearful glances, and an overwhelming sense of anticipation. Everyone could feel it, the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. But no one knew what. Not yet. The air on the farm had grown thick with unease. Every day, the tension seemed to rise like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The foal, once a fragile and weak creature, was now something far beyond anyone's expectations. Its strength, speed, and intelligence had surpassed every animal on the farm, and its behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. It no longer played or ran simply for the joy of it, it moved with purpose, as if it were preparing for something, as if it knew something that no one else did. At night, the foal would disappear into the woods, where the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The caretakers had long since stopped trying to follow it, knowing that there was no point. They could feel the difference in the air when the foal was near, an oppressive, electric charge that seemed to pulse with every step it took. It was as though the very earth itself responded to its presence, shifting beneath its hooves. The farmhands spoke of strange occurrences, lights flickering in the barn, animals behaving out of character, and even the weather turning unpredictable. Some nights, the wind would howl through the trees, bending the branches in ways that seemed impossible. The feeling of something lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding hung over everything. As the foal grew, so too did the mystery surrounding it. People from nearby farms and towns came to witness its strange presence, drawn by rumors and whispers of its power. Some arrived with skepticism, determined to see this miracle of nature for themselves. Others came with a sense of fear, unsure of what they might encounter. They spoke in hushed voices, avoiding eye contact, as if they feared the foal itself might hear them. The caretaker, who had been the foal's steadfast guardian from the start, found himself at a crossroads. He could no longer deny the truth of what was happening. This wasn't just a remarkable animal, it was something else, something far beyond what he had ever known. He had tried to protect it, nurture it, but now he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. He had kept it safe from the world, but now the world seemed to be closing in on them both. He spent countless nights awake, sitting in the barn, staring at the foal as it slept. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. The foal's eyes, when it looked at him, held a depth that unsettled him. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that suggested the foal knew more about the world than it should. The caretaker began to question whether he had been foolish to ignore the signs, to dismiss the growing unease that gnawed at him. What was this foal? Was it truly just an animal, or was it something more? Then came the night that everything changed. It started as a quiet evening, the kind that had become so familiar after the foal's birth. The sky was clear, the stars flickering softly above the fields, and the wind had settled into a calm hush. But something was different. The foal had been acting strangely all day, moving with a restless energy that none of the caretakers could explain. It had refused to eat, instead pacing around the edges of the farm, stopping to stare into the trees, as if waiting for something to appear. By midnight, the foal had vanished again into the woods. The caretaker watched from the porch, his eyes scanning the darkness. A cold chill ran down his spine as he saw the foal's shape moving between the trees, a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. It wasn't the first time it had disappeared like this, but tonight there was something different. Tonight, the air felt thick with anticipation, as though the entire farm was holding its breath. He had never followed the foal into the woods before, but tonight, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to. Something was pulling him, a force he couldn't ignore. The farm, so quiet and peaceful just hours ago, now felt ominous and charged with an energy he couldn't explain. He grabbed a lantern and headed toward the tree line, his heart racing in his chest. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and the sound of his breathing filled the silence of the night. The woods seemed darker than he remembered, the shadows deeper, and the air colder. He called out for the foal, but the words seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the forest. There was no answer. He kept moving, driven by a sense of urgency that he couldn't explain. His eyes darted from side to side, scanning the trees, but all he could see were the outlines of the branches reaching out like skeletal hands, the moonlight casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. The foal had to be close. Then, just as he began to lose hope, he saw a flash of movement in the distance. The foal. It was standing still in the clearing, its head turned toward him. But this time, it wasn't the familiar creature he had come to know. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and its body was tense, as if it were waiting for something. There was a strange, almost otherworldly energy in the air, as if the foal were channeling something far beyond its own being. The caretaker stopped in his tracks, unable to move. A cold, sinking feeling crept into his stomach as he realized that the foal wasn't alone. Something else was out there, something that had been hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its presence, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to be closing in on him from all sides. The foal's gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking, as if it were trying to communicate something. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't understand. The foal took a slow step forward, its movements smooth and deliberate, and the caretaker's breath caught in his throat. There was no turning back now. Whatever was about to happen, it was too late to stop. Suddenly, the trees around him seemed to tremble, the ground beneath his feet vibrating with a low hum. The foal took another step, and then another, its hooves making no sound on the forest floor. It was as if the creature had become one with the forest itself, its very being intertwined with the land. The caretaker's pulse quickened as he felt a force pressing in on him, like an invisible hand squeezing the air from his lungs. He opened his mouth to call out, to ask the foal what it was doing, but no sound came. It was as if the world had gone silent, leaving only the foal and its mysterious, almost hypnotic presence. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The foal lunged forward, its body moving with a speed and power that left the caretaker stunned. He barely had time to react as the foal collided with him, its strength overwhelming him, its force propelling him backward into the dirt. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, but even as he struggled to regain his footing, he could feel a surge of energy, a power unlike anything he had ever known, radiating from the foal. It was as if the foal had become a conduit for something greater, something far more dangerous. The caretaker scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: the foal was no longer the creature he had cared for. It had changed, and whatever force it was tapping into was something beyond his control. The foal stood before him, its gaze unwavering, and the caretaker's heart pounded in his chest. The air around them crackled with tension, and he realized with a cold clarity that there was no turning back. Whatever had been unleashed on the farm was about to reveal itself, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tension in the air was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity, as the foal seemed to draw power from the darkness itself. The caretaker took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to flee, but something held him in place, something that told him he had to see this through. He didn't know why, but he knew deep down that this moment was inevitable. Whatever was going to happen next, it was something he could not escape. And then, just as the air seemed to crack open with anticipation, the foal made a final, decisive move. The foal's movement was swift and almost imperceptible. One moment it was standing still, its eyes locked on the caretaker with an intensity that felt suffocating. The next moment, it had vanished from his view entirely, a blur of motion that left him reeling. His heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, desperately trying to locate the foal in the dark forest. There was a weight in the air now, something heavy and unnatural, pulling at his very soul. He took another step back, his pulse racing, his breath quickening. The foal had never moved like this before. It had always been strong, but now it was as though it had become something else, something far more dangerous. A low growl echoed through the trees, the sound unfamiliar, and the caretaker froze. It wasn't the foal, but something else, something hidden deep in the shadows. His eyes darted to every corner of the clearing, but all he could see was the darkness pressing in on him. The forest seemed alive with sound now, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the unmistakable feeling of something closing in. He turned quickly, hearing the foal's hooves in the distance, but the sound was different now. It wasn't the normal rhythm of a horse, but something irregular, like an animal unsure of its own steps. And then, the real shock hit. From behind him, the foal emerged not as the graceful, powerful creature it had been, but something altered. It moved slowly, almost painfully, as though every step took more effort than the last. The caretaker's stomach dropped as he saw what was happening. The foal's body had changed. Its once sleek coat was now matted and dark, its legs trembling as it stood on the edge of the clearing, its eyes wide and glazed over with something unfamiliar. The caretaker took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What's happening to you?" The foal's head tilted slightly, its ears flicking back, but it didn't move. There was something wrong in the way it stood, something unnatural that sent a shiver down his spine. The caretaker had no answers, only confusion and fear. His eyes scanned the foal's form, looking for any clue as to what could explain this transformation. But before he could even process what he was seeing, another sound broke the silence, another growl, deeper, louder, more menacing than the first. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the woods. And it wasn't alone. The foal didn't flinch. It didn't run. It stood its ground, its glowing eyes fixed on the caretaker with an unsettling focus. The growls grew louder, echoing through the trees, as if a pack of unseen creatures were closing in. The caretaker's breath caught in his throat as a new fear gripped him. This wasn't just about the foal anymore. Something else was at play, something far darker, something that had been waiting in the shadows all this time. He turned, his mind racing. The growls were getting closer, louder, and yet there was no sign of the source. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, responding to some primal signal, pulling everything into its orbit. The caretaker's hands trembled, his lantern shaking in his grip, casting erratic shadows across the clearing. His heart thudded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. How had things gone so wrong? And then it happened. The foal's body twisted, contorted, its form shifting in ways that defied nature. The caretaker's stomach lurched as the creature before him seemed to grow, its outline blurring, merging with the darkness around it. For a moment, the foal seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by the night itself. A new presence, stronger, more imposing, emerged in its place. From the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. Then, a massive shape emerged, dwarfing the foal in size, its form barely discernible in the dark. The ground beneath the caretaker's feet trembled as the new creature moved forward, its growls now vibrating through his bones. It wasn't just a foal anymore, this was something else, something monstrous. The caretaker could only stand frozen in place, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was witnessing. The foal had not been a simple animal. It had been something far more. And now, whatever had been hiding in the woods had come to claim it, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The new creature, a hybrid of shadows and raw power, approached with a terrifying slowness, as though savoring the moment, savoring the fear that radiated from the caretaker. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, and its body, once that of a foal, had now become something completely unrecognizable. Its limbs were long and twisted, covered in scales that shimmered in the dim light. The creature seemed to move with a predatory grace, its eyes locked onto the caretaker with a hunger that was far more than just physical. The caretaker couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sight of the creature before him was so far beyond anything he had ever imagined that he could hardly believe it was real. It was as though the very fabric of reality had ripped apart, revealing something ancient and terrifying. The growls from the forest had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. The caretaker could feel the weight of that silence pressing down on him, filling the space between every heartbeat. He knew, in that moment, that he was no longer in control of this situation. He had been drawn into something far bigger, something that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. Its glowing eyes flickered, its head tilting to one side as if considering the caretaker, as if it were waiting for something. The stillness in the air was suffocating, each second dragging on as the caretaker struggled to make sense of what was unfolding before him. His mind raced. What had he uncovered? What had the foal become? Was it always meant to be this way, or had something triggered this transformation? What had been hidden in the forest, and what was it that the foal had become? But there was no time for answers. The creature shifted once more, its body moving with a fluidity that was both beautiful and terrifying. It stepped closer, its breath heavy, and the caretaker realized with a jolt of horror that it was not merely looking at him, it was sizing him up, contemplating whether he was a threat or prey. A crack of thunder echoed in the distance, and the sky overhead seemed to darken even further. The caretaker's mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was seeing, but before he could think any further, the creature lunged. But just as quickly, the foal, now transformed into something else entirely, intervened. It moved between the caretaker and the creature, its eyes flashing with an intensity that sent a chill through the air. The forest seemed to hold its breath once again, as if the entire world had paused to watch what would happen next. The caretaker stood there, helpless, unsure whether to run or stay, watching in horror as the two creatures locked eyes, each testing the other's strength. The balance of power was shifting, and in that moment, he understood, this was only the beginning. Whatever had been unleashed in that forest was far from over, and he was standing at the center of a conflict that could destroy everything he knew. The stakes had never been higher. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the tension between the two creatures palpable. The transformed foal stood its ground, its body now sleek and powerful, a creature unlike anything the caretaker had ever seen. It was as if the forest itself had given birth to something new, something ancient and primal. The massive creature, its eyes burning with a strange hunger, towered over it, a threat too great to ignore. But the foal didn't flinch. It stood tall, eyes locked on the looming creature with an intensity that spoke of something more than just survival. It spoke of a battle for something far greater than the caretaker could understand. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The caretaker could feel his heart hammering in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He had no idea what had triggered this confrontation, but he could feel it in his bones. This was the moment that everything had been building toward. He had been standing on the edge of a cliff for so long, and now, there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would change everything. The two creatures circled one another, their bodies moving with a fluid grace that belied their terrifying strength. The air between them shimmered with a strange, invisible force, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The caretaker's eyes flicked from one creature to the other, his mind racing. The foal, if it could still be called that, had become something far more than just an animal. It had become a force, a being of immense power. But what was it fighting for? And what was the other creature? Was it a rival? A protector? Or something even darker? Before the caretaker could process any of these questions, the foal made its move. It lunged forward with astonishing speed, its body a blur of motion, and with a single, swift strike, it collided with the massive creature. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, and the caretaker staggered back, his feet slipping on the wet earth as he struggled to stay upright. The two creatures clashed in a whirl of fury, their bodies locked in a battle that seemed almost too fierce to comprehend. For a moment, everything was chaos: the sound of hoofs pounding the ground, the growls and roars of the creatures, the trees around them shaking as if the very forest itself were caught in the storm. The caretaker watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or simply escape. His breath caught in his throat as the foal twisted and struck again, a move so precise and calculated that it was impossible to believe this was the same fragile creature that had been born sickly and weak. But then, just as the caretaker thought the foal was gaining the upper hand, the massive creature retaliated. It swung a clawed paw with a force that could have shattered stone, and the foal was sent sprawling across the ground, its body crashing into a nearby tree. The caretaker's heart sank. Was this the end? Had the foal fought too hard, too recklessly? But no. The foal wasn't done. It rose slowly, its body battered but still standing tall, its eyes burning with a fierce determination. The air seemed to grow heavier, the tension building to a fever pitch. The caretaker's mind raced. What had caused the foal to become this way? Was this a fight for survival, or something else entirely? The two creatures circled again, each waiting for the other to make a move. The caretaker stood frozen, unable to look away from the battle unfolding before him. But then, just as he thought the fight would reach its peak, something unexpected happened. The foal's body shimmered, its form becoming translucent for a brief moment, as though it were shedding its very essence. The caretaker's breath caught in his throat. What was happening? The massive creature hesitated, its gaze shifting to the foal, then back to the caretaker. The air grew thick with tension, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time itself appeared to hold its breath. And then, with a deafening roar, the massive creature lunged at the foal again. But this time, something was different. The foal didn't fight back. It didn't dodge or strike. Instead, it stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on the creature with a strange, otherworldly calm. The caretaker watched in horror as the massive creature reached out, its claws scraping against the foal's side, but instead of blood, a strange light erupted from the wound. The light enveloped the creature, and for a split second, it seemed to freeze in place, its body trembling as if it were being drained of all its strength. The caretaker couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was as if the foal were feeding on the creature's power, drawing energy from it, and the massive being was weakening, its form growing translucent, flickering like a fading star. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the caretaker could feel the earth itself pulling away from him. It was as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. Then, in a sudden, blinding flash, the creature let out a final, guttural cry before disintegrating into nothingness. The foal stood alone, its body now fully glowing, its form radiating with the strange energy it had absorbed. The caretaker could hardly believe what had just transpired. The forest was still, eerily so, the battle over, but the sense of unease remained, like a storm that had not yet passed. The caretaker staggered forward, his legs weak beneath him. He had no idea what he had just witnessed, but he knew one thing for certain: the foal, or whatever it had become, was no ordinary creature. It had tapped into something primal, something ancient. And now, it was more powerful than he could ever have imagined. As he stepped closer, the foal turned its glowing eyes toward him. For a moment, the caretaker thought it might lash out, its power too great for him to comprehend. But instead, the foal simply watched him, its expression unreadable. It was as if it were trying to tell him something, to communicate something beyond words. And then, as if making a decision, the foal slowly stepped back into the shadows of the forest. The caretaker's heart raced as he watched it disappear into the darkness, its glow fading into the night. It wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The caretaker stood there in stunned silence, his mind whirling with the events he had just witnessed. He had uncovered a force that was beyond understanding, a power that had been hidden in the forest for generations. But what did it mean? What had the foal become? And what would happen next? And just as the last remnants of the foal's glow vanished into the trees, the caretaker heard a sound behind him, a whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. It was a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Now it's time. The words sent a chill down his spine. Time for what? And who was speaking? The answers he sought were just beyond reach, but one thing was certain: the foal's journey wasn't over. Neither was his. The caretaker stood motionless in the clearing, his heart racing in his chest, every part of him screaming for answers, but there were none to be found. The foal's glowing presence had vanished, leaving behind only the eerie quiet of the forest. The whisper, soft and unsettling, still echoed in his mind. Now it's time. What did it mean? Time for what? He had thought this would be over, that the confrontation would resolve itself with the creature's defeat. But now, he was left with more questions than he could comprehend. He stepped cautiously toward where the foal had disappeared, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, as if it were holding its breath. The weight of the night was heavy on his shoulders, the air thick with the remnants of the strange energy that had filled the clearing moments before. The forest, once an unfamiliar and daunting place, now felt strangely intimate, as though it had been waiting for him to uncover its secrets. The caretaker's mind raced as he thought back to everything that had led him here: the sickly foal, its miraculous recovery, and the terrifying transformation that had unfolded before him. He had witnessed something far beyond his understanding, something that defied the natural laws of the world. The foal had become something more than a creature. It had become a force, a vessel of power, something that had drawn energy from the very heart of the forest. He knew one thing for certain now: the foal's transformation hadn't been random. It had been planned, orchestrated by something larger than anything he could have imagined. The whisper in the wind, the strange light that had enveloped the creature, was as if the foal had been chosen for something, or had been awakened to fulfill a purpose. The caretaker had no idea what that purpose was, but he could feel its presence in every step he took. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustle in the underbrush behind him. The caretaker spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was nothing there, just the silent forest. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to calm himself, but the unease in his chest only grew. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone for a long time. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to steady his nerves. The forest was silent again, but he knew better than to trust that silence. There was something in the air, something hidden in the shadows, watching him. He had always felt it, the sense that something was lurking just beyond the edge of his awareness, just out of sight. And then, without warning, he heard it. A soft thudding sound, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction the foal had disappeared, and it was growing louder. He stepped forward, hesitant at first, then with more purpose, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. As he moved deeper into the woods, the thudding grew stronger, a rhythmic beat that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath his feet. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if the earth itself was alive with the pulse of something ancient, something powerful. The caretaker's pulse quickened as he pushed through the dense undergrowth, each step taking him further from the safety of the clearing. And then, as if guided by some invisible force, he stumbled into a small clearing. The air here was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and wild plants. In the center of the clearing, a massive stone structure stood, half hidden by vines and moss. It was ancient, older than the forest itself, perhaps, and it radiated a strange energy that seemed to draw him in. The caretaker felt his breath catch in his throat as he stared at it, his mind racing. What was this place? What was its connection to the foal, and why had he been led here? He approached cautiously, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the cold stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy rippled through him, a wave of power that seemed to flow directly into his body. He gasped, stepping back, but the energy held him in place, pulling him deeper into the structure. His vision blurred, and for a moment he lost all sense of time. The world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the strange, pulsing energy that filled his body. He felt as though he were being drawn into the very heart of the forest, as though the earth itself were speaking to him, revealing secrets long forgotten. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the vision ended. The caretaker stumbled back, disoriented, his head spinning. He looked around, and for a moment, he wondered if he had imagined everything: the stone, the energy, the strange feeling of being connected to the earth. But when he looked down at his hands, he saw the faint glow of the same light that had surrounded the foal. It was there, in his very veins, a mark of the power he had just encountered. A voice, soft and distant, whispered in his ear. "You were meant to find it. You were meant to awaken it." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice, he recognized it now. It was the foal, or rather, what it had become. The caretaker's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the foal had led him here for a reason. This wasn't just a random series of events, this was part of something much larger, something ancient and purposeful. The foal had been born weak and sickly, but it had been part of a plan that had now brought the caretaker to this place, to this moment. The caretaker's mind raced as he processed the revelation. He had uncovered the secrets of the forest, the truth behind the foal's transformation, but the answers only raised more questions. What was this power? Where had it come from, and what did it mean for the caretaker, for the foal, and for the world around them? He looked around the clearing, his eyes drawn to the stone structure once more. It was as if the very earth were speaking to him, calling him to take the next step, to uncover the rest of the truth. And despite the overwhelming fear that gripped him, he knew he had no choice. He had to continue. He had to follow the path that had been set before him. With a deep breath, the caretaker stepped forward, his hands still glowing faintly with the strange energy he had encountered. The stone seemed to pulse in response, the ground beneath his feet vibrating with power. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew that this was the only way to find the answers he sought. And as he moved deeper into the heart of the ancient structure, he could feel the presence of the foal, or whatever it had become, guiding him, leading him towards something greater. He wasn't just a caretaker anymore. He was part of something much bigger, something that would change the course of history. The foal had been born weak and sickly, but it had become something far more powerful. And now, as the caretaker followed the path laid out before him, he knew that he too was part of that transformation. The journey was far from over, but the answers he sought were within reach. The forest had spoken, and now it was time for him to listen. As the caretaker disappeared into the depths of the structure, the last remnants of the foal's glow faded into the night. The forest, once silent, began to hum with life again. Something ancient had been awakened. And as the caretaker's footsteps echoed through the darkness, the forest waited, knowing that the next chapter of its story was about to unfold. The caretaker had found the truth, but the world was not yet ready for what was coming next. The secrets of the forest, the power that had been hidden for so long, were now in motion. And nothing would ever be the same again.